9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Marc and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today I'm very happy to welcome, as my guest, welcome back as my guest, Mr. Michael Weiss, outstanding journalist, investigative reporter, an expert on many things, I will say, in the Middle East and having to do with Russia, Ukraine, a good friend of mine. And today is kind of the election day special or pre-election special, a lot to talk about. We're going to go through, several subjects kind of in rapid fire. But most importantly, Michael, we want to pass on some greetings to a new member of the Weiss family.
Yeah.
Humphrey.
Here he is. You got video in this thing, right?
We can do a video clip. There's Humphrey. So Joe, our producer, will make sure that Humphrey will be on the video clip. That's one cute dog. Holy cow.
He's a very cute dog. He's super smart too, man. So he's let's see, he's 75% poodle and 25% golden retriever. And already this dog, we got this special mat because, he can't go outside till he's had all his vaccines. So he's got to do his business in the house. We got this special mat, which is designed to lure the dog. And within 2 days, he's taking care of business on the mat. He knows
you have Humphrey actually vote tomorrow. Or maybe New York City, doesn't matter, but we need all these smart people to vote.
Yeah, well, I'm worried he'd pull the lever for Jill Stein or something.
Let me just say, quick bio. I'm screwing everything up. This is the pre-election jitters. As Michael knows, I've been catastrophizing. But Michael Weiss is an American journalist, author, media commentator. He specializes in international affairs, in particular the Middle East and Russia, as I said. He's a contributing editor at New Lines magazine, the editor of The Insider, which has done some tremendous work on uncovering Russian malfeasance and Russian perfidy. Again, he's broken numerous stories on Russian bad behavior, and he's also a regular network guest, not only on CNN, but also on MSNBC on the earliest of shows. You and I kind of go back and forth on getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and going on with our friend Jonathan Lemire. One more key thing, author of the best-selling book, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, and also a book coming out soon on Russian intelligence, which when it does come out, we will certainly highlight. Again, Michael, thank you so much. And I think, I know we have a lot to cover. Let's just start off with the overall question. I did an interview with Greek television this morning. Their correspondents actually flew, and they're walking around D.C. interviewing people. It's pretty funny.
That's going to be your home in exile, right?
Right. Jesus.
When the deep state's rounded up.
If Trump wins and the deep state is rounded up, I'll be on the Greek islands.
Yep.
No, but I guess the big question is, I think for listeners, they probably know the answer a bit, but I want you to elaborate on more. Why does our election matter to the world?
Well, I think this is probably the most crucial election, certainly in my lifetime and probably in most people's lifetimes. I mean, since the 1860s, I would say. We all thought that Donald Trump was going to kind of recede into the background of America's short-lived but very acute nightmare in 2020 when he lost to Joe Biden. But he made it clear early on he was planning a political comeback. The danger this time, and I've talked to, my field is foreign affairs, so I talk to a lot of people from abroad, including those who have a vested strategic interest in keeping good relations with Washington, D.C., no matter who's occupying the White House, which is to say, if Trump were to be president, they're going to have to do business with this guy. And they're trying to put a best case scenario gloss on the situation. And I say, look, in term one, you had a lot of institutional Republicans, the so-called adults in the room, from Rex Tillerson to John Kelly to Mattis to, these are people who were reining him in, and also actually not even reining him in. Let's be very clear. This is a man who does not want to get his head around the complexities of policy, who was probably signing things into law that he hadn't read, much less become familiarized with, right? I happen to know some of the key policymakers at the State Department who were doing stuff integral to our policy in Syria that Trump sort of shruggingly said, yeah, sure, whatever. And then after months and months of work going into this, and you know how difficult it is to put sort of the fretworks together of a policy, much less in that part of the world, Trump picks up the phone, has a call with Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and basically tears it all up. And the Turks invade northeastern Syria, right? So my argument is this. As bad and as unconstitutional and dangerous as term one was, term two has the very high likelihood of being even worse, because he has said he does not want those fetters of any kind of professional politician or policymaker. He doesn't want institutional Republicans. These are all the people who have betrayed him, who have come out since term one and denounced him and said how stupid he was, how corrupt he was, how venal he was, how dangerous he is for the future of the Republic. So he is going to staff up with the most fanatical loyalists and cranks, including people like Rick Grinnell, Kash Patel, Jesus Christ. I mean, the sort of dead enders of the MAGA world. And these are people who are very outspoken about destroying some of the foundations of what has not only been, the key to our survival as a democracy and a republic, but also to the post-World War II international order, which, as you know, I mean, we've talked about this many times on this show. Right now, you have the largest land war being waged on European soil since 1945. And there is a country that is fighting for its very survival. Things are not going as well as they were a year or more ago. They're terribly worried about the future. We should all be worried about the future. And also, we should be worried if Russia succeeds in dominating Ukraine, where will they look to next? The Europeans are very clear-eyed about this, even if they haven't necessarily got their house in order in terms of being able to sustain their own security, much less support Ukraine. So I would say, this is an election of no choice to me. I mean, I might have problems with particulars of Kamala Harris's proposed policies. I don't even know what some of her policies are. I don't even think she knows what some of her policies are, because she's just kind of made them up on the fly. It does not matter. The humorist David Sedaris had a line in 2016, and he said, this election, meaning Trump v. Clinton, was sort of like being aboard a commercial airliner, and the flight attendant comes up and says, today, for the meal, we have two options. We have a plate of shit or the chicken. And your response is, hey, how's the chicken prepared? It's that, but so much worse right now. And yet we have this kind of prevailing sense. I don't know about you, but I pick it up in sort of the news commentary and just kind of the general electorate's mood that it doesn't really matter. We'll be all right. Who cares? Oh, he says a lot of crazy things. Don't take it serious. Don't take him literally or seriously anymore. My taxes will be lower. The price of gas at the pump will be lower. Eggs will be $1.50 cheaper. I'm sorry, but the stakes are that much, much higher than you think, if that's your logic here.
No, I agree. As you can see, I have this, it's on my camera, I have this giant zit. I'm 55 fucking years old and I have a zit. This is
you get stress acne now. Huh?
I'm catastrophizing, as you know, on a weekly or a nightly basis, but which is actually good. I was going to say I'll be over tomorrow. It might not actually. It might take some time, but I think you raise a couple points, and the other part of it too is that I think Americans don't realize often that the world watches everything we do, and if you look at and still is, despite all of our faults, a beacon of economic and political liberalism. And so if you look at a line for visas at any U.S. embassy anywhere on the planet, it's stretching out the door because America stands for something. But in this case, when you have someone with these and I won't even say fascist tendencies, who's talking, speaking, walking, talking, acting like a fascist. That calls into question all the ideals that certainly I worked for when I was in government. So I think it really does matter. And I have not met anyone. I suppose there are members of the right in Europe who are excited about a Trump victory. Not really my crowd, but in all of my travels and all the everyone I speak with, the usual prevailing line is, what are you all doing? What's happening there? I mean, it's almost disbelief. And so again, when you have members of the Greek press running around Washington D.C. This morning, that to me is a sign of how much the world does actually care.
Well, let me give you two other points. I check in with Republicans on the Hill and in sort of MAGA adjacent circles on a regular basis, because I want to know what the apologetics look like, and I also want to know what they're really thinking. And I'll give you just two anecdotes. When Trump selected JD Vance as his running mate, a very long time friend of mine who works on the Hill, who's deep into Republican legislative politics, called me on the phone and said, vote for Biden, vote for Biden, vote for Biden. This was before Joe had decided to drop out and give it to Harris. And I said, oh, well, this is interesting. So Vance is your red line. He said, 100% absolutely. I said, why? He said, look, Trump is an idiot. We're able to manipulate Trump. We're able to play around him. And, actually, when Mike Pence was vice president, people don't realize Pence wielded a great deal of influence because Pence was a normal politician, conservative Republican, but normal. And so we were using him as sort of a way to get into White House, mucking about. He said, Vance is a hardline ideologue. People are like, oh, he's a chameleon. He hates Trump. He's changed it. No. Vance has cast his lot with a kind of isolationist libertarian right in this country, terminally online, to the right probably of the Cato Institute. And you need only look at his legislative staff, right? He's a U.S. senator from Iowa. He has staffed up with people who are avowed supporters of Vladimir Putin, supporters of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who say, and here I'm speaking of James Braid, his legislative director, that sanctions on Iran are a casus belli. So the United States shouldn't have any kind of policy that tries to hem in rogue regimes, or no containment, no deterrence. And Vance is a smart guy. And, this is somebody who will wield an extraordinary amount of influence. I mean, I was literally, before going on your show, reading David Frum, his sort of closing argument for a Harris vote in The Atlantic. And he said, don't underestimate the power that the vice president can actually have in a very, very weakened presidency. And, Trump is showing real signs of cognitive and physical deterioration. Can't open the door to a truck. He's filleting a microphone on stage. So all he has to do
in international history for the United States, I must
exactly.
say.
All he has to do is show up at noon to the Oval Office while Vance has already been there for 6 hours, from 6 a.m. onwards. And Vance is going to start having his paw prints all over American policymaking. That terrifies me. That terrifies a lot of institutional Republicans who are, by the way, deeply anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine, all of the things that you and I believe in, they still believe in. They've just kind of bit their lip and gone along with this MAGA ride. The other thing I put to them is, listen, you guys have kind of been in an internal wilderness for 10 years because everything you want, everything you desire, you don't really get. They'll make excuses. Oh, we put sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and it was Trump who sent javelins to Ukraine. I said, yeah, but in terms of a grand strategic vision for what you want the United States to be and what you want it to be outside of its own borders, this guy has not delivered for you. Don't you want to be a normal party again? Make the Republican Party great again. Don't you want to be even in opposition? Like they could be running to the right on Joe Biden on Ukraine. And by the way, I would be with them on that. I would be critical of this administration if there were people like John McCain and Mitt Romney saying, we need to do more for Ukraine. We should have more security assistance, deep strike authorization, and the full nine. But there's no party. It's a personality cult where even the good guys are paralyzed by fear and their own imminent irrelevance if they step out of line and criticize the standard bearer, who's Donald Trump. So even Republicans, I think, want this nightmare to be over with, which I think may actually inform the vote.
Right.
I
think that I know how it's going to go. So, I'm having a terrible personal time with friends of mine who are Republicans right now because I know some of them will vote for Trump. But I also know if Trump loses, they're going to come to me and say, thank God, because we can now rebuild the party. Now, I don't know if it's so infected by MAGA, but certainly they will have an opportunity because they will be able to demonstrate that, look, we keep losing.
And there's no successor to Trump, right?
And I think let's jump back we'll start. We're gonna talk Middle East. Let's save that to the end. Let's jump right into Ukraine as well, because I think you have some very solid access into kind of thinking not only of the U.S. administration but also of the Ukrainians. Yeah. And so I guess I think we have to break this down. Let's break this down into the what I think we would agree the most optimistic scenario is Harris wins. Mm-hmm. So what happens in the period between administrations, the lame duck Biden administration, and then what happens when Harris takes over with conceivably a new cast of advisors? What's your predictions or thoughts on what we could see?
So I have it on fairly good authority from people inside the administration that we haven't seen much movement in terms of U.S. policy with respect to Ukraine prior to the election, because there is a fear at high levels, I mean, the president himself, that doing anything would sort of have the unintended consequence of swaying the election in the other direction, giving Trump ammunition he doesn't need or whatever. However, and much to my surprise, I was given a sort of shaft of optimism that if, say, Harris were to win tomorrow, that the transition period, this sort of interregnum of 6 months where you expect nothing to happen, actually some things could happen, including the deep strike capability that you and I have been advocating that has gone nowhere. That's still evidently on the table. That's a debate that's continuing to be had. Now, I never worked in government. And evidently, when you work in government, you become so inured to the Alice in Wonderland bureaucracy and sort of illogical nonsense that is just kind of par for the course, that I'm going to explain to you what I learned yesterday, which kind of shocked me. So at the start of the full-scale invasion, I guess even before it, the president gave an order to the Pentagon. Priority number one is do not allow the United States to get involved in a shooting war with Russia. It's a pretty good, commonsensical set of instructions there, right? It's a nuclear power, our old adversary. We're under no illusions as to what Putin might do if he's provoked, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of prime directive, to use RoboCop terminology here, has been so enshrined in how DOD goes about its own internal planning that the Pentagon has not actually provided the President of the United States with a risk assessment of what might happen if, say, the U.S. authorized Ukraine to use ATACMS, or we allowed the Brits to let them use Storm Shadows to strike deep inside Russian Federation territory. So in other words, all the stuff that's being leaked to the press about, well, the assessment is the Ukrainians will not benefit militarily from these things because the range isn't long enough, and this might be too escalatory. It might set Putin over the line. It might lead to a nuclear escalation, et cetera. That is not coming from an actual military perspective. The boffins at the Pentagon are simply too afraid to actually go out of line and violate that prime directive. So, in other words, the president is not operating from a full suite of options. He's not looking at an analytical plan that says, if I do X, Y might happen. Now, this kind of blew me away because, as you and I know, and I mean, I've written about this with James Rushton, and I mean, the Institute for the Study of War has done very granular analysis. There are plenty of targets the Ukrainians could hit inside Russian territory, right? Not just air bases, but logistical supply lines and command centers. There's also targets of opportunity because it's Russia. They don't do things by the book. They're sloppy, they're corrupt, they're ad hoc. By the way, there are air targets because the way that the Russians do things is their planes take off farther afield than from the range of ATACMS and Storm Shadows, but they often land at airfields or air bases closer to the border, well within the range of ATACMS and Storm Shadows. And that's either to fuel up or to load their payloads of glide bombs, whatever. So the notion that this is not going to help the Ukrainians is nonsense. They're taking out of Russian ammunition depots inside Russian territory with their own homegrown systems, drones, and so on, has dramatically reduced Russia's ability to resupply artillery, which, as you know, I mean, artillery is one of the key elements of this war. So a ratio that might have been 8-1 before, taking out these warehouses has now dropped to 2-1. Still in Russia's favor, but not as dramatic as before. So there's some wiggle room here. Now, the one thing I'm a little bit optimistic about, not optimistic, but I can entertain someone being optimistic about. Putin is going to do to Kamala Harris what he loves to do to all newcomer presidents, much less a woman, right? I mean, this is a guy who, let's say, doesn't have DEI protocol at the forefront of his consciousness.
Probably more of a misogynist than Trump, if you can even imagine.
This is a man who, knew that Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs and brought his giant Labrador into the meetings with her. He likes to abase. He likes to humiliate, particularly women. So he's going to see Kamala Harris come in, a black woman, no less, and he's going to want to test her in a rather nasty way. And I'm hoping that the cop in her comes out, and because she senses that she needs to prove herself, that she's this untested quotient in the realm of foreign affairs, that she might actually bloody his nose.
Michael, I've heard that same sentiment from someone who is close to the Harris campaign.
Yeah.
And in terms of her ability to do this, don't forget what we saw at the debate where she actually savaged Trump.
Right.
And I think she would actually not only kind of rise to the occasion, she'd welcome this. I mean,
Correct.
again, people I think underestimate her as a former prosecutor. So I think that that to me makes a lot of sense. And so I think what you're saying is, all is not the kind of the status quo of whatever that is of the Biden administration may not kind of keep going even during the transition. There might be an ability to do more for Ukraine, and certainly under our Harris administration, things may change a bit. But let me just I got to throw one provocative question to you, because I've talked about this so much, because there's two sides to this. Ultimately, and I think President Biden cares, but what is his legacy on Ukraine at the end of the day? Or is it too early to tell right now because we don't know how this ends? But if you could kind of give an elevator pitch of what his legacy would be, the good and the bad.
I think his greatest moment in office was understanding that the Russians were going to invade, and then taking a decision to declassify the intelligence almost in real time, really as a way to rally reluctant or skeptical allies into understanding that this was going to happen, and it was going to become this sort of world historical traumatic event, especially on European soil, because it was the allies I'm talking about were mostly Europeans. The French didn't believe this was true. The Germans were skeptical. I mean, we've talked about German intelligence being almost kind of fiefdom of Russian intelligence, so that doesn't surprise me. But I think that was his finest hour. Unfortunately, a lot of bad conventional wisdom had so permeated all levels of policy making and policy planning that the reluctance to send weapons to Ukraine, at least more sophisticated, decisive weapons. I mean, we gave them anti-tank missiles, Stingers, anti-aircraft, but basically we were preparing for them to devolve into some kind of guerrilla insurgency style government in exile, partisan warfare that kind of defined the post-World War II era, particularly in the Baltic region. That's what we were forecasting. And it all turned out to be wrong. I mean, Phillips O'Brien and Elliot Cohen wrote a very good paper about the analytic community's failure to take into account other variables besides what had been this sort of Potemkin paper cooked up by the Russians about their bright, shiny new army under the guidance of then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Corruption, which is the sort of cancer that eats everything in Russia, hollowed out the Russian military-industrial complex, as anyone such as Alexei Navalny, the late Russian opposition leader, could have told you it would have done. The Ukrainians learned in the space of 10 years how to fight. And not just how to fight, but how to fight the Russians, because I forget what percentage of their population had seen some combat experience since 2014 until the full-scale invasion in 2022. So it turned out, actually, Ukraine exists as a state 3 years into this war. It has an army that is now better equipped, almost NATO interoperable, increasingly NATO interoperable. And a lot of these things could have been done quicker and in greater numbers or a greater order of magnitude that might have saved a lot of Ukrainian lives and might have kept the Russians more at bay, even though the Ukrainians put up a hell of a fight. So, look, I give Biden credit. He took this very seriously. I mean, I can't imagine what Trump would have done had the intel said the Russians are looking to invade. I mean, he'd have got on the phone with Putin and said, well, Putin told me he's not going to do it, so end of story, right? So, hats off to Biden. I have criticisms, though, and I will confess something. As a journalist, I probably shouldn't. A lot of those criticisms I've kind of kept to myself because I do think the alternative is that much worse.
Yeah.
But if this goes correct on tomorrow, I think that, there's got to be a good revisionist history of the mistakes that were made and mistakes that could have A, saved Ukrainian lives, and B, bloodied the Russians even harder and earlier. and not had the situation we see now where, defensive lines in Donbass are deteriorating on the Ukrainian side. The Russians are, it's not as apocalyptic as some of the media would portray it as such, but it's not good. And it's being told to me as not good by people who I've relied upon to kind of give me a more, objective appraisal of the situation than whatever the media narrative of the day is. So I'm worried about Ukraine, whatever the election result is.
So we've talked about Ukraine with the Harris victory. We've talked about Biden's legacy. In my favorite period now again of catastrophizing, and let's not even talk about the United States. But if Trump wins, what happens with Ukraine, in your view?
Well, he has said he wants to end the war in a day. What does that mean? Well, here's another interesting data point. So, JD Vance has been more specific about how he anticipates wrapping this whole thing up. Freezing the war along the current contact line, which is now changing in Russia's favor slightly, more than slightly. Ukraine committing to neutrality. So no NATO membership, no EU membership, frankly, because there are security guarantees that come with EU membership. And basically, essentially giving the Russians what they wanted at the start. I mean, I just read Sistema, which is a Radio Free Europe Russian language outlet, obtained all of the documents showing what the Russian demands were at the start of the negotiations to end the war from February up until, I think, April of 2022. The demands at the start were categorical. I mean, it was essentially unconditional surrender by Ukraine, demilitarization, reinstitution of Russian iconography, which is to say, glorification of Soviet communism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Reintroduction of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is a clearinghouse for Russian intelligence and active measures, all of these things. I think that's Vance's way of ending the war. And interestingly enough, what I'm hearing from Eastern Europe is this is what the Russians are saying they would like to propose after the election. Now, whether or not the Russians are talking to JD Vance or the Trump campaign, I mean, our friend Bob Woodward's book suggests that Trump has had, 8 calls with Putin since leaving office, or that Moscow and Trump world are independently alighting upon the same exact scenario for ending the war. I leave to your audience to decide. But I think basically it's capitulation. Wrap this thing up. We don't want to deal with it. We want to deal with, putting legal and illegal immigrants in internment camps, in preparation for their mass deportation. I mean, all the priorities of Project 2025.
And one key point, too, I think, when we talk about potential agreements, if there were to be some type of agreement down the line, and this would only happen with the Harris victory, in which Ukraine would have to actually accept losing some territory. If that went along with NATO ascension, there's a pretty good case to be made for that. That's a good deal for Ukraine. That will never happen, of course, in a Trump-Vance administration. So even the idea of where the lines are frozen. The idea of first of all, it would be a weakened NATO, but the idea of NATO the U.S. ever kind of accepting Ukraine into NATO under a Trump presidency is just not even, I think, in the realm.
Here is why nothing succeeds like success. So the report I just alluded to by Sistema, I encourage everyone to read it because the interesting disclosure there is the Russians and by the Russians, Putin was the one making all of these calls, right? They increasingly lowered their demands as time went on. And what happened in April of 2022 when these peace talks in Turkey were put to an end? That's when the Ukrainians booted the Russians out of Kyiv, right? The Battle of Kyiv was effectively won in April. So when you defeat them, when you show them that you can put up a fight and that they have a lot of friends, a coalition behind them that is willing to invest in seeing their victory, all of a sudden, interesting things started to happen, such as before it had been, Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk are Russian Federation territories. No discussion. Then it was their disputed territories, or their final status would be determined through diplomacy. Interesting. Crimea was seen as this sort of sacrosanct item on the Russian agenda with respect to this war. Right now, all of a sudden, it's on the table for future talk. So if Ukraine were given a credible invitation to NATO by the United States along West German lines, and I mean, I leave it to defense policy planners and NATO experts to figure out how this would exactly work. But if they were given that kind of invitation with the stipulation that all of the territory of 1991 sovereign Ukraine, including Crimea, including the 4 oblasts that Russia claims to have annexed, even though it doesn't control all 4 of them, would remain not acknowledged as Russian territory, I think a majority of Ukrainians would take that deal.
Right.
Because NATO membership guarantees that Kyiv will never fall,
Right.
that Ukraine will never have to face this again. I mean, a war of extinction. And it's something for all of their sacrifice. I mean, Zelensky's political problem right now, and one of the reasons he doesn't want to lower the age for enlistment in the military from 18 to 24, which is what Americans are saying he should do, is he needs something for what Ukraine has given up. I mean, tens of thousands of people have been killed or maimed. Children have been rendered parentless. They've been rendered orphans, brothers. I mean, he needs something. And that something can't just be solidarity and good feelings and draw down authority packages. It has to be something in perpetuity and guaranteed by fire and steel, because nobody's going to buy another Budapest memorandum.
That's right.
Right.
Let me ask you a quick question. We're at the half-hour mark now. I know Humphrey might need a shot from the vet. Do you have a
vet
more
coming
minutes?
to my house to give him one of his vaccines.
Do you have 5 minutes to talk Middle East?
Sure, always.
All right, let's just switch focus here. I know this is kind of rapid fire again in our election eve special, but one of the things that I think you've been really good in our private discussions on identifying is how much the Middle East has changed over the last year. October 7th being a day of incredible tragedy.
Yeah.
For Israel, I would also argue for the United States. So we had 1,200 Israelis killed, but also 46 Americans, which many people in the U.S. seem to forget. But things are changing so rapidly that as we analyze the Middle East, the status quo is no longer. You have a Hezbollah, which has been battered. Hamas is certainly has as well. The Iranians are probably playing with fire now, and if they decide to retaliate against Israel, Israel is going to have absolutely no one holding them back. Lebanon has the potential for change as well. And so I think the way I look at the Middle East is to try to actually remove all of my biases over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Because I think the region is changing. So give us a couple minutes, your thoughts on where we are. And look, we can say this also while acknowledging that the civilian casualties in Gaza have been awful. I think there is reason for some optimism that things may change. Your thoughts?
Well, let me put on a reportorial hat first and say that right now there's a great deal of daylight between the United States and Israel with respect to Gaza.
Right.
Because that is, I mean, whatever your point of view is, that is a humanitarian catastrophe, right? And it's one that does not reflect well on the United States as the patron of our client Israel, because we have been arming Israel to wage war in the way that it has. And also, our policy continues to be, there must be a Palestinian state at some point. And the Israelis now are saying, actually, no. And the electorate, for, I think, probably the first time in a long time, is kind of agreeing with the government in this respect because of the trauma of October 7th. That's something that has yet to really penetrate the Western policymaking and punditry circles that, we like to think that, it's all Netanyahu. You remove Bibi and suddenly Israel becomes the Israel of Shimon Peres. No, the country has shifted.
Yep.
And this is something that needs to be appreciated. But one thing I will say, which is kind of interesting, is there is less daylight between the United States and Israel on Lebanon. Because I think the policy that the Israelis have pursued in Lebanon, and it's taken a bit to figure out exactly what they're doing, apart from just annihilating Hezbollah, blowing their balls off with exploding pagers, dropping, 1,000-ton bombs on Hassan Nasrallah, taking out his successors even before their, personnel file has been updated at Hezbollah HQ. I mean, what they're trying to do is sort of exacerbate the contradictions inherent to Lebanese political society. So they are sending a message to the Shia of Lebanon that your fortune does not need to be inextricably linked to this terrorist organization, this paramilitary apparatus, this mafia that has captured your state, which, by the way, is really just, it's the long arm of Iran. Do you not want to be a sovereign nation? Do you not want to have some agency? Do you not want to have Lebanon become a kind of European haven within the Middle East? I mean, Beirut has long been known as the Paris of the region, but it's a little bit difficult to be the Paris of the region when, you have a globally notorious terrorist organization in control of much of it. Yeah. So there is a more of a crafty political agenda attached to Israel's military operation or campaign in Lebanon and the United States. And look, I'm going to be very honest with you. I think a lot of it is utopian. I think people are, they see opportunities, they want to get creative. And I've dealt enough in this part of the world to know that, it's the good intentions paving company, right? We want to do nice things, and it never really goes the way we plan it. But there is this idea that we can somehow refashion Lebanon into more of a normal state and less of this Iranian satrapy. Because it's true, Hezbollah has been really badly hurt. It's not out, but it's down. And I mean, I'm getting reports that actually people are defecting in the south from the organization.
Right.
People, even those who had once seen Hezbollah as an actual resistance, who supported Hezbollah in 2006, the second Israel-Lebanon war, who started to turn against Hezbollah because of their intervention in Syria, but then sort of forgot about all that and really expected them to uphold this notion of the ring of fire that Iran had constructed. In other words, they were going to defend the nation from an Israeli attack. None of this has come to pass. And as a result, Hezbollah and Iran both look fundamentally weaker than a lot of their propaganda, which we have assimilated into our own policymaking, would have suggested over the last, 25 years, certainly the last decade. And yeah, I mean, the mullahs are on the back foot. I mean, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, has got cancer. He's in his 80s. He's not long for this world. I think he's even older than Joe Biden, and certainly looks. What becomes of the regime? Do
Let
they
me ask
want
you,
to?
we're going to close. We're going to close with a provocative question for you, and I think my feeling on this. And again, I think you and I have been, amongst many commentators, we have been both certainly not in any way supportive of a future Trump presidency, but we also have been appropriately critical of the Biden administration when it was warranted. But I'm going to say something that's going to drive, of course, many people on the right in the U.S. and in Israel crazy, because it's my contention that President Biden actually is the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history. And it's not even close when you have 40,000 American servicemen and women defending Israel right now. That statement, Biden is the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history. What are your thoughts?
I mean, people who lived through the Reagan administration, could you imagine Ronald Reagan allowing the Israelis to do what they're doing?
He withheld F-16s sales.
Correct.
Correct.
George H.W. Bush. No, it was George W. Bush who prevailed upon the Israelis and the Palestinians to hold elections, which is how Hamas swept into power. 2008. I mean, no American president has come. And by the way, the left portray this as Biden just being utterly feckless and allowing Bibi to run circles around him. I mean, there's an element of that. But really, in the Middle East, Biden has long been very skeptical of America's involvement in this part of the world, right? There's I think in a previous Woodward book, he's quoted as saying, well, America shouldn't keep troops, and we're talking Central Asia now, but we kind of in our popular imagination conflate Afghanistan with the Middle East because of our involvement
over there
with the war on terror, let's say. Yeah, but he says we shouldn't be in Afghanistan just to ensure little girls go to school. Kind of a bit of a heartless remark, but it reflects his kind of realpolitik. However, the one exception to this is Israel. He has long been wedded to the notion of Jewish statehood. He is a Zionist, which for an Irish Catholic in America is not an easy lift, I'll tell you. And yeah, I mean, he has this kind of romantic idea of Israel, which arguably doesn't even exist anymore as sort of what the state is and what the society is. But it harkens back to Ben Gurion and Golda Meir in that era, right? He has allowed the Israelis to completely annihilate Hamas. He said, "Don't go into Rafah," but they did. Did they pay a price for it? There was one, I think, moratorium on a weapons shipment, but that was lifted. They've gotten everything that they wanted in terms of security assistance. They certainly have the political support. It's cost him a great deal amongst this progressive left, consortium of actors, both on university campuses and within his own party and in Congress, as represented by the Squad. He doesn't care. And in Lebanon, as I say, he's, don't kill Nasrallah. Oh, you did. Oh, okay. Well, hang on a minute. Hezbollah is not quite the formidable proxy that we anticipated. So now let's try to architect into place a new Lebanon policy. I get it. The pro-Trump, pro-Israel right want to say that Biden is in hock to the Iranians, just like Obama. He doesn't really care. He's not out to win the war. It doesn't matter. Objectively, he has allowed things that he might not have wished to see happen.
But they've happened.
And it's been one country he's allowed to do it. And, for instance, the retaliatory strikes in Iran, right? You know this through your reporter friends. I know this independently through administration. There was a bit of a drug deal here. Like, okay, don't hit the nuclear program. Don't hit the oil infrastructure. We're worried about hitting the oil infrastructure. Why? Not because of prices at the pump, but because we're worried the Iranians are going to retaliate by hitting the Saudi oil infrastructure. The nuclear program, yes, that could drag the United States into war. These are legitimate considerations. So what did we do? Meaning the United States. We gave Israel the THAAD air defense platform. I mean, the Ukrainians would cream their fucking jeans, if I might say so, to be able to get the THAAD, not just for the platform itself, but for the 100 American servicemen that come along with it, who are on the ground in Israel. And we sent B-52s to bomb the Houthis in Yemen. So a real show of force by the United States. No other country in the world would get that kind of assistance from the United States to basically do what they want to do in contravention of what the United States is telling them to do. So how do you measure this? Is it what's in Joe Biden's kishkas? What does he really think about Netanyahu and the Israel? Who cares?
Right.
The policy is the policy, and they have basically got everything that they wanted.
I agree with this, and I also we're going to extend it just one more because I have one more question on this, because there also is the case, as we have 24 hours until election day, that there are these reports, and I'm not sure I believe them, that Iran is going to retaliate against Israel, and if that were the case, do you think there would be that same type of kind of U.S. pressure on Israel not to hit things such as energy infrastructure or nuclear sites? Because in some ways, and I do think there's a political dimension as well, the Biden administration didn't want anything kind of crazy to break out right before the election, but the election's over. And so, with these, 6 B-52s now in the region, another another wing of F-15s, would the U.S. be less reluctant now to directly assist Israel on any kind of confrontation with Iran now that the election is over?
I think it depends on what form that retaliation takes and what's the carnage of it. The last time the Iranians sent, more than 120 ballistic missiles at Israel, they killed one guy, a poor Palestinian guy in the West Bank, originally from Gaza. Right. If they end up killing scores of Israelis, or they end up hitting, for instance, F-35s, on the tarmac, suddenly I think that the Israelis have a better case to make, that we need to, take the gloves off and hit them where it hurts. And now the last strike, I was watching it in real time, and I was thinking, this is a bit of a damn squib. Like, what's going on here? And then the battle damage assessment was actually they had completely taken out all of Iran's S-300s. Right. So it's essentially hobbled their air defense capability. Now, that is a telegraphing of what they can do if they so choose to do. So the Iranians would be really, colossally stupid. And also, at this point, the instigator of a region-wide war. They got their licks in. The Israelis retaliated. It could be left there. If the Iranians decide, no, we have to do something to show that we're still strong and powerful, well, then they risk the worst case scenario for themselves, which is dragging the United States into war. And by the way, the Israelis would love nothing better.
Well, that's the thing.
Would love nothing better for the Iranians to miscalculate and push a button and get the Americans to start hitting Iranian military and critical infrastructure.
All right. Well, you have you have young Humphrey to take care of now. Humphrey has a vet appointment for some shots. We wish Humphrey the best. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Michael, for coming on the Above Average Intelligence Show. We hope you'll consider doing so again. Obviously, it's some big news coming up over the next week, and so we'll have a lot to talk about.
Well, the way you extend the invitations, I don't have a choice. I basically have
to. DSR will be back later this week with more of our regularly scheduled pods, and I hope you'll join us for them, and then join me once again for the Above Average Intelligence Show. This was the election eve special. There's no one better to talk to about really important issues around the world than Michael Weiss. Michael, thank you so much for joining. And hopefully I'll stop catastrophizing. I have 24 hours left. I think I have to run out to the ABC store and get some more bottles.
Well, I was going to say, as far as political exiles and refugees go, you cooling your heels for 4 years on a Greek island, that ain't so bad,
Fair enough. Thanks again, Michael Weiss. Have a great day, and good luck to Humphrey.
Cheers, man. Take care.
Hold on, don't get off yet.